Hi, I'm Michael and welcome to my URUSHI studio. Today I'm going to walk you through grinding and polishing materials and tools I use in my workshop. Here in front of me there are two the most extreme examples. So very harsh whetstone and the finest abrasive possible, and it's migako powder, migako powder. I will show both later and how and for what I'm using them. But let me start with something most people are asking and are mostly interested in. So, do I use charcoal? Charcoal is a traditional abrasive used in Japan for a lot of work in urushi workshops. But to tell you the truth, right now it is mostly used only by maki-e artists, not people who just cover objects with urushi. I use charcoal from time to time on different surfaces, not on everything, and mostly when I use gold or silver powder or gold or silver leaf, because some kinds of charcoal that give me more feel than other abrasive materials. But in reality, modern abrasives are much better. They are more consistent, they are much cheaper because charcoal is extremely expensive, can be extremely expensive. They are consistent, they have very predictable gradation, you don't have to prepare them to work with them. So most artists in Japan and all over the world use abrasives papers, abrasives gloves, abrasives, abrasive sticks, and something which is whetstone, but I can show it here. It's a whetstone, but it's artificial and it's very light. It's kind of a foam in a structure, so it's very light and it's very soft. You can easily scratch it with your fingernail, and they have gradations from, as far as I remember, 500 up to 3000. And they behave just like charcoal. I have here pieces of charcoal. Here are the small ones, and here's something which is already used. You can easily cut both. So you can cut charcoal to smaller pieces and use them, but you can also cut those whetstones. There are several kinds of them. I buy them in Japan, but they are available in some e-commerce in Europe. I don't know about US or Canada, but in Europe it's available at Dictum in Germany. And that's where I bought my first batch. But then I started bringing, it's from Dictum, for example, but then I started buying them from Japan because it was much less expensive, even considering duty and taxes. But right now it's impossible due to COVID. But I have a lot of them. It will last me at least several months. So I was talking about 3000. Here is the 3000 kind. And the harshest I have here is 1000. This one is 800. And somewhere here I have also a 600 one. One of them is 600. Probably this one. I don't remember. It should be written somewhere. It's 150, this one is 600, so it's this one here. I cut them to smaller pieces. They are color-coded. Some of them are color-coded, some of them are not. It's printed on them. So when I cut off the piece and shaped it to match the surface of the pen. For example, this one is shaped to match a pen here, like this. It's much easier, much faster to polish, to grind the surface of something which is round with something which is round also, or something which is convex is used on something which is suited to this. Charcoal is much less convenient because it breaks, it crushes, it's not very easy to cut, but as I said, I sometimes use it. So that's it when charcoal is concerned. I definitely recommend using those artificial whetstones, artificial charcoal, foams, or whatever you call it, but it's much more convenient and you have exactly the same results. So using charcoal is more of a traditional way of doing that. But it's something like with a Shaolin temple. So when you really know how Shaolin temple monks train, they train in a gyms, in a metal huge rooms with modern infrastructure, and they train them there a lot, but for television purposes they use traditional spaces of Shaolin temple. It's exactly the same with URUSHI, maki-e, and charcoal and other stuff. When they are filmed, they use charcoal, but most days for real job, for most of the work they do, they use modern materials like those I showed you. Another type of material which is very important is sandpaper. As you see here, I have a lot of sandpapers, different kinds. So from traditional sandpapers of very high quality, and the best quality I found are automotive use sandpapers. There is a mess here because I finished a session recently. Through all different kinds and flavors of micromesh. So I have micromesh in pots, in small pots, in micromesh cloth, and some blocks to use with micromesh, some hard blocks, some soft blocks. It's a kind of a foam which has some give. So when I use it with micromesh cloth, it is slightly softer than using this block, which is very hard. So it depends what kind of surface and what kind of pressure I want to apply. So I can take it like this and use on some flat surface, or use it with this block and push the pens on the surface of this block, which is soft, and it will give some round shape of this cloth here. So for very difficult to reach areas, I use those files. They are also from micromesh. But I also, as I said, I also use traditional sandpapers, and I cut them to very small pieces usually, and I use them both wet and dry, and it depends on the purpose I have. Usually, the closer to the last layer of the urushi, the less aggressive materials you use. So for grinding first layer, like base layer, key urushi layers, sashima urushi layers, you can just use like 800 grit sandpaper and go fast. Don't worry about scratches. Just level it up, flatten it, and put another layer. When I'm doing intermediate layers, I use much higher grit sandpaper, but I do not care too much about small scratches or something like that. I just try to level it up, smooth it, make it look good, unless the following layers are transparent. Then I make the surface perfect. I bring it to the level I would consider ready to uvazuri. So talking about uvazuri, after putting last layer of urushi on the pen, you have to level it, like flatten it, but with much less aggressive materials. I usually start with 2000 grit micromesh, but only for not very perfect layers. I try to make them as good as possible to grind less, because grinding is mundane and grinding takes time, and grinding is nothing glamorous in grinding. And And I start with 2000 grit, then move to 320, then move to 4000 grit of micro mesh. Usually end with 6 or 8000 grit, and then move to polishing pastes and polishing powders. One of the best thing I found is Japanese polishing paste. It's called Kiku-mol, and it's quite aggressive. It's usually used for polishing metals, but for the last step of leveling, before I start using extremely high grit sandpapers or polishing liquids like this one from Microgloss, so from the same producer as Micromesh, or this one from Rustins, like varnishing cream, or more traditional ways. So one of the Uvazuri powders, this one is green, so this one is finer one. There is also a white one, so two Uvazuri types of powders. But also you can use Tonoko clay. Here, this one is put through the sieve, and when you want it to be more aggressive, you just use it mixed with oil. If you want it to be less aggressive, you mix it with much more oil and then filter it through the same paper I filter urushi. This way you get extremely delicate polishing oil, something like that. And those two powders for Uvazuri are in such packaging. You receive quite a lot. It's expensive. It's like something like 6,000–7,000 yen. I don't remember how much is it in euro, but there is a lot of it in the package. So it will take, for me, it will take ages to use everything, and that's why I repackage some of it to smaller containers, much more convenient to use than those packages I receive them in. And I have a lid just to take just a part of this powder to use on with oil or without oil, depending on the situation, depending on the purpose, depending on the type of urushi or step in the process I'm doing. Another more or less maybe more traditional type of abrasive is again charcoal, but this time it's charcoal powder. It's powdered charcoal, and I use it. I use it especially for finishing my first tries of maki-e. It's quite controllable and very, very delicate in use, so you cannot overdo. From the beginning I'm doing urushi, my main problem was, and the most important mistakes were actually two. The layers were too thick. Three problems. The layers were too thick, the brushes were not clean enough, and I was doing too much grinding. So I could grind through the layer, I didn't even notice. Sometimes slightly too aggressive sandpaper, or slightly too aggressive whetstone, or not enough care taken into mixing oil with powder, and you go 1 second too long and it's gone. You go through the layer and it's destroyed. You have to start over. You have to grind to the bone, or just take a much harder sandpaper, mat the surface and start over. It's nightmare. So those were three lessons: thinner layers, cleaner brushes, and cleaner area where you do urushi, and very, very conscious and slow grinding and polishing. One more polishing, grinding and or polishing material is powder made of whetstone. It's also very, very fine. I use it also in the final steps, so Uvazuri, just before the last polishing steps, Uvanuri. And Uvanuri is the most magical step in all urushi process. You use migaki powder, which is absolutely the finest abrasive I have ever seen. I cannot even compare it with anything. If you try to compare it with 12,000 grit micromesh, 12,000 grit micromesh comparing with this is extremely aggressive. This powder is so fine, you cannot even feel that you're using anything. And for the first steps in uwazuri, you use this powder mixed with oil. And for the last step, for the final polishing, you use just this powder and you use your own hands. I usually use this part of my palm to polish a pen. And you take just a little bit of this powder, you put this on the pen like this, and you polish it like this. But it's only the final polishing. You remove any oil which could stay in the surface after last layer of kiyomi urushi, so finishing urushi, which is just wiped in, and then use this migaki powder. That's it, more or less. I started with this huge and very harsh whetstone, and this is used for flattening charcoal or those whetstones I showed you before. So when the surface become cracked or not level, you just use it to level or shape such pieces of charcoal. You can easily cut them, so it's quite convenient. So from this whetstone to migaki powder. That's it. Thank you very much. See you next time. Please like this video, subscribe and hit the bell button. Bye.